congratulations to make the quarterfinals. Alright, thanks. Appreciate it. Alright, we good now? Fantastic. And it's my time.
Absolutely.
No problem.
Of course, I'm sick.
Thanks, appreciate it. No one can forget the fateful day when an UNRWA ambulance that was supposed to be used for the good of the people was hijacked by terrorists and used in a plot who were actually employed by the organization to kill civilians in the country of Palestine. Yes, what we'll be talking about today is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, specifically that war-torn section of the world that has undergone a severe conflict. The resolution specifically today is resolved that the efforts of the United States in the Israeli-Palestinian peace talks have done more harm than good. I'll repeat that again for your clarity. Resolved, the efforts of the United States in the Israeli-Palestinian peace talks have done more harm than good. Now, to evaluate this resolution and see exactly what we were talking about, before we can lay the arguments, we have to look at the resolution itself. So a couple of definitions. First, the peace talks will be defined as the peace process between the two nations, the ongoing process that the two nations are engaging in to resolve the conflict. U.S. efforts will be defined as the intervention of the United States in the conflict to better the conflict. So not just in the peace talks, but also everything the United States has done to further the peace talks and the peace process, as it is a more holistic approach to the resolution, a more realistic approach. Now we have three framework points under this resolution, three standards. First, we have to recognize that it's a fact resolution. So this resolution is proving a statement of fact. Secondly, we evaluate past actions. Not what will happen in the future, but what the United States has done, what efforts the United States has already taken. Third, we have to evaluate the entire scope. My third point is entire scope. So we're not simply looking at one peace talk or something that happened in the last week, but everything the United States has done in all their efforts to influence the peace process between Israel and Palestine. Now the framework for determining more harm than good, how do we figure that out? Well, what we're basically setting out is a standard. If the United States, the efforts that the United States had taken were taken out, would the conflict be better? Would the situation be better if the United States had not intervened in the way it had? But there are two specific ways to look at this. First, on the conflict itself, to Israel and Palestine. But second, to the United States. So if their efforts harm the United States, it also factors into that more harm than good. So we have three contentions to prove this resolution true. My first contention is the United States harmed. The United States harmed, and I have two subpoints under this. My A subpoint is spent money. Spent money. And I'll show you later how this money really hasn't had any effect. But the United States has spent almost $5 billion to Palestine and to Israel to resolve the conflict in order to move the countries towards that peace process. $5 billion is an inordinate amount. Yes, I'll recognize this point of information.
Alrighty. Now, would you agree with me that Palestine has threatened Israel?
Yes, and Israel has also threatened Palestine. There are tensions on both sides. Now, we're specifically looking at under the money. If we were to compare a nominal GDP, so adjusting for inflation, the amount of money that was given to Palestine in order to resolve the conflict, that would be more than 10 times the amount of money that was given to all of Europe after World War II, just doing the simple math by adjusting for inflation. That is an extreme amount of money, and money the United States simply can't afford to spend as it pushes itself further and further into debt. My B point is security harm. Security harm. The United States intervention has only made more terrorists attack United States outposts and been more angry at the United States. The United States has actually suffered severe backlash because of its intervention in the Israeli-Palestine conflict. My second contention is masking the real problem. Contention 2 is masking the real problem. Now, I have three subpoints under this. My A subpoint is the problem has deep roots. The problem has deep roots. You see, these two countries are fighting because after the Arab-Palestinian conflict, what happened was the two nations split off. There was the indigenous population of the Palestinian area, but the Israelis who were fleeing Europe after the Holocaust wanted their own nation. So the United Nations partitioned the two lands and gave the certain land to Israel and the other land to the Palestinian Authority. But what is deep in the conflict is the mindset. The mindset. Why? Because it's first a religious conflict, and second a territorial conflict that goes back for thousands of years, if we look at this realistically. It goes all the way back to the Old Testament when the Jews and the Arabs were fighting over the land. They look to their scriptures to determine what land is theirs, and no one will resolve the conflict until either side controls Israel, and controls, more specifically, Jerusalem. The Palestinians want Jerusalem to be their capital, and the Israelis want the city of Jerusalem to be their capital. The United States cannot solve that underlying mindset. My main point is the United States is ignoring the roots. The United States feels like this is just another conflict that can be resolved by simple peace talks. It's not. The mindset must change before peace is possible. My C point is only the Middle East can help itself. Only the Middle East can help itself. I'll recognize this when I'm done making this point. What basically has to be done in a conflict is the parties need to resolve the conflict for themselves. If a third party acts, it will confer legitimacy to one side and just brush away the underlying causes of that conflict will spark up in the future. Yes, I can recognize this.
Wouldn't you agree that the United States believes in their foreign policy efforts that diplomacy must always be the first step before hard power?
The United States generally seeks to have diplomacy in their actions abroad. However, as we're saying, diplomacy is not effective in approach to this specific conflict. But we have to recognize the impact of this problem. The first is, of course, backlash, because the Palestinians and even the Israelis increasingly are angry at the United States because of their intervention. My second impact is the problem is prolonged. The problem is prolonged because the United States is simply brushing aside the real issues in order to deal with what they think is the diplomatic issue. My third contention is actually inflaming the problem. Inflaming the problem. My A subpoint here is terrorist funded. A lot of the Palestinians want the United States to keep giving aid because it goes to terrorists. And a lot of that money went to Yasser Arafat, a man who was one of the richest men in the world because he siphoned money from U.S. donations. My B subpoint is the Palestinian people harm. The Palestinian people harm. Way back after the conflict, the United States at the United Nations headed up the UNWRA, the UNRWA program. What this did was it permanently branded every Palestinian as a refugee. These people could not be resettled under international law. What has happened? All 5 million of them remain refugees to this day. Because of the United States has actually prolonged the conflict, it has done more harm than good.
Coming together is a start. Working together is progress. Keeping together, that is success. Henry Ford. It is because my partner and I believe wholeheartedly in Henry Ford's quote that keeping together, that is when we achieve success, that we stand strongly to negate the resolution, that U.S. involvement in mediating the peace talks has not done more harm than good. Now let's go ahead and take a look at some of the definitions that my opponents presented. Now we do agree with the idea of their definitions for the most part, but one point of clarification that we need to make. Now this was under essentially a point of resolutional analysis. Now they talked about how we need to be looking at everything the United States has done, not just the peace talks, but I have a problem with this, judges. This is what's called extra-resolutional. This is debating something that is outlined outside of the resolution. The resolution specifically states U.S. involvement in Israel-Palestinian peace talks. It's not asking about U.S. involvement in just the efforts as a whole, and their military involvement, other forms of involvement. It's asking about their involvement in the peace talks. So that is what we need to be focusing. The impact of this, or why this is important, is because it's exactly what the resolution is asking us to debate. Now let's go ahead and take a look at a point of resolutional analysis, which we'll get to after this first of two questions.
Yes. Has the United States' efforts in trying to resolve this conflict, first, have they been aimed at resolving the peace talks, and second, have they affected the peace talks?
All right, we'll take a look at that as we move throughout the case, but we need to look at if they've been aimed at the peace talks and if they've been effective. We believe they have been aimed at the peace talks. The United States has served as essentially a moderator in the peace talks, kind of like the overseeing parent with the two fighting kids, if you will. but also if they've been effective. And we'll be looking at that as well. My partner will be bringing up some additional quotes to show you just how impactful the U.S. involvement has been. But let's go ahead and take a look at our points of resolutional analysis, really taking a look at the resolution. The first one is a question that I have for you, our panel of judges. What would happen if the United States was not involved? What would happen if the United States was not involved? Now, currently, the United States is involved, and right now we have Israel and Palestine at odds. They're having discourse, but they are currently at odds. What would happen if they were not involved? We believe that it would be potentially an all-out war. There could be much more bloodshed happening. It could be an escalated situation much more than it is right now with the U.S. mediating it. Secondly, we have an option to look at this resolution. The job of the opposition today is either to prove that they've done more good than harm, or to simply to prove that they've not done more harm than good. Essentially a balance. So we'll be keeping that in mind as we move throughout the points made up by the opposition. Now, my partner and I believe that this is a value resolution. So our value for today is going to be regional stability. Regional stability. Now, regional stability is essentially stability within the region, to put it plainly. We believe that regional stability is so important in the Middle East, especially because we are allies with Israel. They are our foothold in the Middle East. We need to uphold that alliance with Israel and assist them because they have been threatened and achieve regional stability. This benefits the United States greatly in the end. So let's go ahead and take a look at the opposition's first contention. That is the background of the situation, just so we really understand what's happening. Now, we need to be looking at both sides, Israel and Palestine. Now, right now, as has been happening as the case and is currently happening, Palestine is the one that's supported by the international community. Take a look at the United Nations. The United Nations has previously recognized Israel as a state. Right now, they're looking to recognize Palestine as a state. Now, what does that mean? Essentially, it's recognizing Palestine's claim to legitimacy and their claim to land, essentially giving them the right to invade Israel and to claim that land. They're claiming them as a legitimate state. So they are backed by the international community, specifically the United Nations. Now, who is backing Israel? If you take a look at the world regions today, there's no one that's backing Israel except for their ally, the United States of America. Now, this leads us to our second contention, the U.S.-Israel alliance. The U.S.-Israel alliance. Now, the United States has a mutual defense treaty with Israel called the Memorandum of Understanding. Now, essentially, this says that whenever Israel is threatened, the United States comes to their aid, vice versa. What's happening right now? According to a point of information that my opponent agreed with, Israel is being threatened by Palestine. Now, this is so important because this mandates our intervention in some form to protect Israel. Now, the United States foreign policy says, as the first point, their foreign policy is always to try soft power, then hard power. They have sent diplomats in to mediate peace talks to resolve the situation between Israel and Palestine, and so far, they have been effective in preventing an all-out war. That alone is points saying that they have done more good than harm. They have prevented all-out war between the two countries. This is very, very important when determining your decision in the resolution. Also, this sets a precedent with the United States. If we maintain our alliance, it shows our allies that we are willing to be faithful to them. We are willing to step up and protect them, even if it's something as small as mediating the peace talks. It sets a precedent and eventually benefits the United States in the end, with other countries saying, wow, the United States is faithful. They will maintain their alliances. We can come to their aid because we know that they will uphold us in the end. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the opposition's third contention. That is the most effective way. The most effective way. Now, when we look at options the United States could mitigate or could mediate with these peace talks, you have diplomacy, boots on the ground, sanctions. Those latter two options, sanctions would cost you, the American citizen, extra money, and boots on the ground would cost lives and a lot more money. We need to be looking at diplomacy as the most effective way in the resolution today. Now, our final contention is just going to be an application showing you how this works. So it's possible to moderate peace talks. It is possible to moderate peace talks. Now, the application we're going to be bringing up is that of the Camp David Accords. Now, if you're familiar with this, this was an agreement that the United States helped moderate between Israel and Egypt. They were at odds, something similar. It was a different conflict, but the odds were similar to what's happening right now with Israel and Palestine. The United States was able to mediate that, and the Camp David Accords are what came from that. So when we leave this case of the opposition today, I have two questions for you. What would happen if the United States didn't help? I asked this question in the beginning. What would happen if the United States didn't help? If the United States was not involved in the occurrences that are happening right now, the two countries would be at all-out war. Can we allow this to happen to our ally? Absolutely not.
If everybody's ready, then let's get started. The way to solve a problem, or in a garden, the best way to get rid of weeds is to pull them up by the roots, not just to hack away at the leaves. But oh, so much of the time, do we as the United States believe we can solve conflicts by hacking away the leaves, by ignoring the roots? Because if it looks aesthetically pleasing, then obviously the problem must be gone, right? No. That's never the case. While our efforts at peace may chop away the leaves and make it look all fine, the problem is that the roots still exist. And as long as those roots exist, the weed will keep growing and keep growing and keep growing. It is because I believe in this statement that we stand firmly resolved that the U.S.'s efforts in the Israeli-Palestine peace talks have done more harm than good. Now what I want to be doing is responding to a lot of their argumentation they presented in the last speech, showing why at the end of the day the government's contentions are still proved true, and why our efforts at trying to solve or trying to further the peace talks have done more harm than good. Let's look firstly at their first argument, which is that of extra resolution. Yes, I'll take your point of information.
All right, now you talk about how we need to fix the roots, but you haven't presented a way for us to effectively fix the roots.
That's a fundamental misunderstanding of where the debate is coming from. We're debating whether or not our efforts currently are doing more harm than good. There are other means that may solve the problem, but we're not debating that. We're debating whether or not our current efforts are doing more harm than good. Our current efforts are hacking away the leaves. There may be a way to pull up the root, but that's not what we're talking about in today's debate round. Let's look at the first of extra resolution. Now they talked about how past actions that are not related to the peace process are outside the resolution. I have two responses. My first of which is go back to our definition of the peace talks presented in the Prime Minister's constructed. That is of the peace process, meaning everything leading up to the peace talks. You can't have peace talks if you can't get both sides to sit down at a table. Which leads me to my second response. That is, everything we do tries to make sure that we can have peace talks. Think about it this way. When we try to appease Palestine, we're trying to get them to even sit down at the table with Israel. When we try to send aid to Palestine, we're trying to get them to say, hey, you might want to sit down and talk to Israel at some point of time. That is part of the peace process. You can't have peace talks if both sides refuse to sit down. So the actions that we take in giving aid to Palestine and trying to appease both Israel and Palestine are attempts at starting the peace talks. So they're not extra resolutional in today's debate round. Now, they talked about their second point, which was that of regional stability, and that is the utmost of value. I have two responses. First of which is that the talks, we need to understand the purpose of the talks. Now, what is the U.S.'s goal in mitigating the conflict? The goal is of a two-state solution, meaning we have the state of Palestine and the state of Israel. Which leads me to my second response, that a two-state solution is not stable. A two-state solution is not stable. Look at the roots of the conflict. Both of them believe that the religion dictates that they have Jerusalem as their capital. The problem is that Jerusalem is one city and there's two states. As long as you try to have a two-state solution, one side will always want their side to be proven. Whether it's giving Jerusalem to Israel, the Palestinians will always believe that that's theirs, and in turn they will fight for Jerusalem. If you give Jerusalem to Palestine, Israel will say, no, Jerusalem is ours, and fight for Jerusalem for their side. A two-state solution simply is not workable, which is the U.S.'s end goal. So we're looking at regional stability. The U.S.'s even main purpose in these peace talks is not going to promote regional stability. And in fact, if we've seen anything over the past couple of years, it's that the regional stability of the Middle East has even decreased. Look at the multitude of civil wars inside of that region. Now let's look at their first contention, which is that of other people's mitigation actually makes it worse, and how we need to protect our allies. I believe I'm going to group both their first and second contentions, actually. They talked about how, as long as we help Israel, it'll make sure that we have their back in the alliance. I have three responses. My first of which is that we're actually not fulfilling our burden to Israel. Think about it this way. We're trying to negotiate a two-state solution. What is the one thing Israel says it will never do with Palestine? A two-state solution. We're trying to back our ally in Israel, and at the same time, while saying that, we're double-crossing them and saying, hey, Palestine, we're going to do exactly what Israel doesn't want us to do. By taking this route in the conflict, we have not only effort and made the conflict worse, but we've actually disgraced our allyship with the country of Israel. Yes, I'll take your point of information.
Have we assisted Israel in preventing an all-out war and harming them even more with a war with Palestine?
A war with Palestine? In all honesty, they want Palestine not to exist because they feel like they're taking up land that was originally theirs. But secondly, you provided no warrant for the claim that there would be an all-out war. But third and finally, if you think about it, there is an all-out war. Think about Hamas and the Israeli government. How many times do we hear the statement that Hamas has launched rockets into Tel Aviv or another major Israeli city? Now, while we may not be sending troops into one country or another, both sides are sure attacking each other well enough. So even if you believe that there would be, or rather, that conflict would still exist, the U.S.'s mitigation efforts are not in any way preventing that. But furthermore, by trying to get both sides to agree to something that neither of them want, we're only aggravating the conflict further. Now, their third contention was that of the most effective way. We need to find the most effective way. My first response is respond to under the idea of regional stability, or not regional stability rather, or what was that? Oh yes, regional stability, how they're not stable, and the best way to mitigate conflict. Okay, we're not debating what is the best way, but we're debating what the U.S. is doing now. So we need to look at what they're doing. But if we look at my response to this up above, we can see that what the U.S. is trying to do is not the most effective way. We're trying to get both sides to agree to something that both of them fundamentally religiously believe that is not okay. When we force one side to compromise its religious values in order to help another side, it's not doing the best thing for the conflict. We're debating what is the best way to mitigate. We're not debating what is the best way to mitigate the conflict. We're debating about the U.S.'s efforts now. If we take a look at the U.S.'s efforts, we can see that both sides are no longer close to a peace talk. In fact, when John Kerry arrived in Palestine to try to get peace talks going again, not only was he not received well, but he was protested against with signs saying, "John Kerry, go home, we don't want you here anymore." That's surely not moving us to a peaceful settlement between the two countries. They've done more harm than good. But third and finally, they talked about the idea that we can moderate the conflict. I believe I've been responding to this throughout the entirety of my speech, but I'll make that a little bit more clear right now. The first thing is that we're forcing them to forsake their religion. In order to have a solution that both sides want, both of them have to forsake their fundamental beliefs. In order for Palestine to be happy, they have to have Jerusalem. In order for Israel to be happy, they have to have Jerusalem. Both people cannot have the city of Jerusalem. So trying to do otherwise, we can't moderate that conflict. But that's the exact approach the U.S. has been trying to take. What does this all matter in the end of today's debate rounds? We can see that the U.S.'s attempt to solve the conflict simply hasn't worked. But if we look at the money we've given, it's only gone to harm Israel through Hamas and to harm ourselves through terrorist attacks. It is for this reason that the U.S.'s aid to try to solve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict has done more harm than good.
I believe we need to move to more meetings and more direct negotiations, more than we have had so far. And I think the Americans know this. American involvement, yes, but as facilitators of bilateral agreements is essential, end quote. This was a quote from C.P. Levine, who is the current Minister of Justice in the nation of Israel. She recognizes the importance of United States intervention in these negotiations, United States moderation. Today we're going to be responding to the arguments made in the last speech and responding to the contentions of the government team. So with that said, I'd like to look just to the definition in general. And in their last speech, they were talking about the definition of peace talks, and as a result of that, our resolutional analysis point did not apply. And so I'd like to really clarify what we're talking about in this debate round, what peace talks really are, because I think that the fundamental definition has been misunderstood and is not being represented correctly. Peace talks are defined as discussions or series of them between dissenting groups or countries to attempt to end hostilities. That's what a peace talk is. It's not negotiations or boots on the ground. We're talking about specific peace talks. It's talks and negotiations, discussions between different countries. It's not the entire process that the United States is going through, and this is essential to keep in mind. The impact of this is that we need to be looking at really the common man, the perspective, the general perspective of what the definitions really are. We're not looking at the entire process, we're looking specifically at the talks, specifically at the discussions. That's what the resolution is asking of us, and that is what we're focusing on. So with that said, I'd like to look to their first contention. And their first contention was that the United States is harmed, and I have a few responses. They talked about spending money, the United States spending money and security being harmed. My first response to this is peace talks. We need to keep in mind what peace talks really are. And so that really the contention of the United States spending money, $5 billion in ideas such as aid, we're looking specifically at peace talks, not other forms of intervention. Yes?
Is it not true that you cannot have peace talks without both sides being at the table?
Both sides being at the table, absolutely. And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the discussion between two different countries. And so with that said, I'd just like you to keep in mind the definition of peace talks. That's my first response. My second response to this is the United States Mutual Defense Treaty. We talked about this, my partner talked about this in her last speech. The United States is absolutely not harmed. We're fulfilling our agreement to the nation of Israel, as we'll see later. This is actually an advantage to the United States specifically, not a disadvantage. My third response to this is, what if the United States was not involved? What if the United States did absolutely nothing? And they were talking about how security is harmed as a result of this, but security would be detrimentally impacted if the United States was not involved in this country. And the United States intervention into this conflict is absolutely essential, as we saw the quote at the very beginning of my speech. Yes?
And your warrant for that is?
The fact that the United States has been successful in this conflict is the fact that the United States has been mediating the conflict. These two nations, Palestine and Israel, have not done anything to resolve the conflict. The United States' efforts at moderating the conflict are bringing the countries together, approaching and moving toward a solution. With that said, let's look to a few advantage points. I just want to look at the advantages that the United States gained from this specifically. First of all, we've looked at how the United States is not harmed, but there's two advantages. First of all, U.S. credibility with other nations. It gives us credibility in other Middle East conflicts, and also in the Middle East Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It gives the United States credibility because we're upholding and fulfilling our agreement to the nation of Israel. The second is that of security. Again, if the United States were not involved, these countries would be able to go at each other with no mediator, no moderator between them. The United States action is essential. Let's look to their second contention of masking the real problem. I have several responses. My first response is no alternative. No alternative. The government team, in their speech, never actually presented an alternative to this policy. We, as the opposition team, believe that that alternative of the United States doing nothing is fundamentally flawed and detrimental to the United States. It would only be counterproductive if there was no moderator in the conflict, not right now. Let's look to my second response, which is the resolution to the conflict is possible. Resolution to the conflict is possible. We see a specific example of this in the Camp David Accords, and we see how this was really an ingrained conflict between Egypt and Israel, possibly more ingrained than that of the Israel-Palestinian conflict. But there was a resolution that was possible, and that was only possible through United States involvement in the conflict. We absolutely can reach a solution, and that has to involve both Israel and Palestine. Without the United States, these countries have no conflict. They don't even come together and try to agree on this policy. If there is to be a solution, it has to involve both of those countries. Without the United States, there is no solution. My third response is that U.S. actions are essential. What if the United States did nothing? We looked at this earlier. My fourth and final response to this is no Middle East solution. There is no solution if we simply leave it to the nations of the Middle East, Palestine and Israel. And actually, the government team brought this up in their speech, that these nations, Israel and Palestine, have tensions between them. They're never going to come to a resolution on the conflict on their own. If not, there's going to be more violence. And that is why the United States action is essential. Let's look to the third and final contention, and that is of the peace talks. I believe we're in protected time now. Under the inflating the problem, the third contention. And the point A here was that terrorists are funded. The point A was terrorists are funded, and I have two responses to this. First of all, peace talks. Peace talks. And we're looking at the definition of what peace talks are. We're not looking at United States funding to this issue. We're looking at the peace talks, the discussions, and the United States moderation itself. My second response is mediation. The United States' role is mediating the conflict, and so we're not focused on mediating. Their B point on this was the UNRWA. And my response to this is United Nations, not United States. The resolution specifically asks for U.S. intervention into the Israeli-Palestinian peace talks, not United Nations intervention. So for all these reasons, we can see that the United States is playing an essential role, and it's doing more good than harm.
Coming together is a start. Working together is progress. Keeping together is success. Now, if you remember, I opened with this quote by Henry Ford. I said that my partner and I absolutely believe in what it says. Coming together is a start. Working together is progress. Keeping together is success. The United States cannot simply leave the conflict or leave what they've been doing just because it's not working as well as the government team would hope. We need to look at what the United States has done, and that is more good than harm in the situation. And I'll be showing you why that's so important as we move throughout the rest of the round today. Now I'm going to be going over some of the points that my partner made really clear, and really impacting those and show you why those matter, and bringing you some very clear voting issues that absolutely pertain to the round and show you what is important in those voting issues. So let's go ahead. I'd like to remind you of something that the government team brought up in their first speech. That was the standard of the resolution. Now they said that we need to be looking at whether if the United States came out of the conflict, would it be better? Now they're saying that if the United States came out of the conflict, that would be better. That was the standard that they set at the beginning of the round. Now we brought up a quote, my partner brought up a quote in his last speech by a Justice Defense Minister in Israel, and she said the United States must maintain what they are doing. They cannot pull out. The United States may not be doing enough right now, but if we pull out, what would that do to Israel and Palestine in the future? That's a vital, vital question that you as judges need to be considering in today's debate round. What would happen if the United States pulled out? Right now they are mediating peace talks. They are keeping these two countries at the table, talking things through, working out the problem. But if they pull back from those peace talks, what would happen? Now they talked a lot about the root of the problem. I have a couple of responses just looking at the root of the problem. One is, in their minds, the root of the problem will never be solved. So they'll continuously be at war. Now exactly, what if the United States pulled out? What if the United States was not in that conflict mediating it? And they had such violent oppositions on both sides? There would be all-out war. They said there's no proof for this. Their own case is proof. If the United States pulled out and was not there to mediate and to offer essentially the parent over the two fighting children, whether or not the conflict gets resolved, the United States pulls out, that would be doing far more harm than it would be doing good. Because of what the defense minister in Israel was saying, if the United States pulls out, that is where the harm comes in. Now we need to be looking at their first contention. Now they talked about the United States being harmed. Now my partner talked a lot about our alliance with Israel, but I want to bring up one more additional point in continuation with the alliance with Israel, and that is that the United States is protected in the long run. The United States is protected in the long run. We are in a mutual defense treaty with Israel. That right there is reason alone that we are doing more good than harm. We are promoting our alliance. And according to our Constitution, Article 6, this is extremely, extremely important to promote our alliance with Israel because they are to be the supreme law of the land. But when we look at this alliance with Israel, it's a mutual defense. We will come to their aid, and they will come to ours in the future. We're aiding them, our ally, offering them protection and offering to fix the root of the problem and helping them to resolve and stay away from all-out war. We are protecting Israel in the long run, keeping them from all-out war. Now let's go ahead and take a look at some examples under our case that we talked about. Now they talked about the U.S.-Israel alliance. We said that we are not upholding Israel. Now again, I said the root of the problem, according to their case, they said it won't be fixed, the root of the problem, but the point is we are protecting Israel in the long run. The United States is saving them from all-out bloody war. We are keeping the two away from each other. We're keeping them at the table with peace talks, trying to find a solution. Henry Ford, keeping together is success. We cannot abandon the problem simply because there's no clear future in sight. We have to keep with the process and keep the two from all-out war, protecting our alliance with Israel. Now, we talked about the Camp David Accords under here. Now, we talked about how the United States can moderate peace talks. My partner brought this up in his last speech with the Camp David Accords, which I'd like to remind you was not addressed by the government team. But this is the idea that we can moderate peace talks with deep-rooted, hard feelings against each other. We can moderate peace talks and come to a successful conclusion. So that leads us to our voting issues. The two most important things I believe in this round that you must help to base the round off of. The first one is what would happen. What would happen? And then the second one is more good than harm. More good than harm. They go along with each other. But what would happen? What would happen if the United States pulled out? It would be causing more harm than good because these two countries would be going to all-out war with each other and would not be able to sustain. So United States presence is vital to the protection of both. Thank you.
A very credible source, and by far my favorite BBC character, Sherlock Holmes once said, "It is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. Insensibly, one begins to twist facts to suit theories, rather than theories to suit facts." It is precisely because the opposition has been doing what Sherlock Holmes warned against, twisting facts to suit theories, and making theories that are irrelevant to the debate, that I stand resolved that the efforts of the United States in the Israeli-Palestinian peace talks have done more harm than good. Now, it's curious that they've asked the question, what would happen if the United States pulled out over and over again? I find this irrelevant to the debate. You see, the question is not what would happen if we weren't there, but what would happen if we hadn't done what we had done. We are simply evaluating what we had done in the past, not whether or not we have an obligation to protect Israel, not whether or not we would help Israel in the future, but what the facts are in the past. And that's why I ask that is your simple weighing mechanism for today's round, is the facts. Looking at the facts in the status quo and in the past, what has happened, and has it done more harm than good? Would the situation be better if the United States had not done everything it had done? So I have 3 voting issues to affirm this resolution. The first is the U.S. has been harmed. The United States has been harmed. Now, in the long run, a mutual defense treaty could be helpful. But again, this is irrelevant to the debate. Now, a little bit about the definition of the efforts and the peace talks and what we're exactly talking about. My 8th subpoint under this voting issue is everything the United States has done has been an effort to help peace talks. The resolution simply says to prove that the efforts in the peace talks have done more harm than good. Not necessarily the peace talks themselves, but the efforts. And so everything that we've done to bring them to the table to try to resolve the conflict is included in the efforts. And my simple reason to prefer this is reality. When we look in reality in foreign policy, we don't simply look at talking to one person. That's just one simple step of the process. The process is much more complex than that. My B subpoint is that even peace talks cost money. So Air Force One actually costs quite a bit to take off the ground. It also costs a lot of money to fly John Kerry over there, who is then booed by the Palestinians and the Israelis. I probably would boo him myself. However, that's irrelevant to this debate, again. But the fact is that even if you accept that interpretation, it still costs money. And has that money really done anything? No. My C point is increased terrorism. Because even peace talks can intensify the international debate, which has, in fact, led to increased terrorist attacks. My second voting issue is that the United States is a bad gardener. The United States is a bad gardener, and this is specifically looking at the root of the problem. Now, we're not saying that the problem could never be solved. We're not saying that, we're not saying necessarily that this is impossible, that there's no hope for anyone. We're saying what the United States is doing is ignoring the facts in the current system. You see, my A subpoint is there's no evidence the United States intervention has actually helped. The opposition has yet to bring up, and since there are no speeches, the opposition has not brought up any examples of specifically where United States action has led to less tension. My B subpoint is that all-out war has no ground in reality. There's no reason to believe that if the United States did nothing, there would be all-out war. In fact, my C subpoint is the parties are resolving the conflict. If we look at the reality in the present system, almost every peace talks that have happened has been initiated by either the Israelis or the Palestinians. The United States just goes there to moderate. The Palestinians and the Israelis, we have two factions of Palestine. Hamas, which is crazy. I get that. But second, we have the Palestinian Authority, which are actually trying to resolve the conflict. However, my D subpoint is that the root is ignored. And that's what the United States does. Only the actors in the Middle East, only those who are involved in the conflict will know how to solve that conflict. The United States doesn't, because they believe Israel is in the right in everything. However, the conflict must be reached by a mutual agreement by the two parties, not by some other mediator. My third voting issue is the United States has planted more weeds. The United States has planted more weeds. And my A subpoint is that the United States has funded terrorists. So if we look at the holistic approach, we've seen millions and millions of dollars, $300 million going to Yasser Arafat to fund Hamas, dollars going to actually increase the amount of terrorism. We've seen the example as this round opened up of an ambulance that was used for the people but hijacked by terrorists to kill the population. My B point is that the United States created UNRWA. The United States created UNRWA. So even though it's a UN program right now, it was an inception of the United States, which permanently branded all 5 million Palestinians as refugees. They cannot resettle. So by that alone, it's done more harm than good. The United States has harmed this. There is hope, but the facts prove the resolution true. Thank you.